This week in the podcast, we're talking about elements of the Black Lives Matter protests in North America. We're talking about left-wing politics in South Africa, as well as anarchist groups in Greece and violent communist insurgencies taking place in the Philippines. Keep watching to find out more.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Insight Weekly, an intelligence fusion podcast that provides you with a new insight into the global security landscape every single Friday. If you enjoy our podcasts, don't forget to hit subscribe and get new content sent directly to your inbox. Today I'm joined by intelligence analyst Matt Pratton and Max Taylor here at IFHQ, and dialing in remotely we have Daniel Harrington and Viraj Patni. This week the team are discussing far left groups and extremism from the left. Each analyst is discussing a pattern, trend, or even a threat actor that they've been monitoring across their region. Firstly, we're heading to the US and discussing the Black Lives Matter movement. Before Matt takes it away, however, it is worth noting that prominent members of the BLM leadership have stated that the organisation is a Marxist group, and their aim is to dismantle imperialism, capitalism, patriarchy, and the state structures that disproportionately harm Black people across the world. With that said, we wanted to explore the possible links between the recent unrest following George Floyd's death and the far left extremist groups. We do have a more detailed document from our CEO explaining the link between Black Lives Matter and extremist views. I'll add a link into the YouTube description for those who are interested in reading more about our analysis. Over to Matt.
Well, with the deaths of George Floyd in Minneapolis and Rashad Brooks in Atlanta and the subsequent fallout, there's been, of course, plenty of incidents which have provided quite a good insight into the current nature of left-wing extremism in North America. Now, I suppose when taking a look at all the protests, the riots, the looting, which the riots and looting seem to have died down quite a bit, but a lot of protests continue. But overall, what's sort of noticing with the nature of left-wing extremism at the moment is it seems to be more of an ideology rather than a number of organised movements. The key indicator that we're seeing from this so far is that when it comes to the leadership of these groups like BLM, Antifa, or a variety of other actors, is there's very little, in fact, in some cases, no information whatsoever on the group's leadership. I mean, for example, with Black Lives Matter, trying to take a look into the leadership of the group. Now, according to the group's own information, there's only sort of 3 key leaders at the top, but between them and the sort of, I suppose, actors on the ground at the protests, for example, mainly, there's quite an absence of names on who runs those areas, except for just I suppose that the group is organised into chapters across a lot of major US cities, and other groups like Antifa, there's in fact very little, in fact no information whatsoever. And in some cases, there's quite a bit of interaction between the various groups, in which would suggest that on the ground, I suppose BLM Antifa could in fact in some cases be one and the same. But amongst another major development we're seeing with a lot of the incidents is that amongst the various incidents involving Black Lives Matter, Antifa, is that it's noticing several lines of operation at tactical, operational, and strategic levels. I mean, starting with a tactical level. Among there's the protest riots and looting, vandalism of statues, and other forms of direct action. Now, a lot of these actions appear to be chaotic at first, but with the resulting lawlessness from all these, there's sort of emergence of autonomous zones being set up in major cities. The most noticeable, of course, is the one in Seattle, which started off as the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, but now known as Capitol Hill Organized Protest. And most recent one would have only just recently seemed to have been established in New York City outside City Hall. They're calling that one the New York City Hall Autonomous Zone. And essentially what these areas are allowing these groups to do is essentially set themselves up and, I suppose, solidify their positions. And as a result, police have not been able to go into those areas, which has seen quite a few instances of lawlessness occur, especially in Seattle. Looking at the operational level, the groups appear to have excellent lines of communication through apps such as Telegram. And through these apps, they've been able to spread quite a bit of information on tactics, techniques, and procedures, and also provide some excellent situational awareness to protesters on the ground. In fact, in a lot of cases, they use a military reporting format known as acronym known as SALUTE. And their sources for these reports, a lot of cases, they are able to get access to police scanners, and they've been these lines of communication have been very effective at prolonging the protests. And when the riots and looting were occurring, those lines of comms were excellent at keeping those going for as long as possible. And I suppose another development at the operational level is their logistics. There's appear to be very well organised in this regard. During the high point of the riots and looting, we came across various anecdotal reporting that indicated that pallets of bricks were getting delivered at locations near where protests were being organised. Now, oddly enough, where these pallets of bricks were being delivered, there weren't any construction work going on whatsoever, and no one seemed to notice that. No one seemed to raise any suspicion about these until after the fact, until they're actually noticed having been delivered to those areas. So the fact that such a large amount of deliveries of bricks were occurred across the country and no one's saying much at all, their logistics and lines of communication appear to be quite covert, resilient, and very, very effective. Which, combining that with their lack of sort of organizational structure, it's quite sophisticated. At the strategic level, these groups have been carrying out information operations through their narratives of justice for George Floyd, and that's since developed into defund the police. And these have not just been slogans chanted by protesters, but these narratives have been aimed at city and state government officials, and their effectiveness has been quite impressive. With that, these state officials have been beginning to accept these narratives and take action in regards to defunding police, or even in some cases abolishing their police departments.
So Matt, earlier you mentioned the SALUTE acronym for communications. I was just wondering if you could explain what that means.
Yeah, of course. My apologies. SALUTE stands for size, activities, locations, uniforms, tactics, and equipment.
Okay. So I heard that. I thought it could be quite interesting. So what kind of fallout have we seen from these protests and from their actions?
Aside from the widespread damage caused to commercial businesses, there's been two other major developments coming from the fallout of all these actions. The first one would be that with the autonomous zones that have been created, there's been quite a few instances of, in fact, quite a few shootings. In fact, I know. If I remember correctly, in Seattle, we've come across at least 4, and one of those was a shooting murder. And the other major development actually is that now we're starting to see pushback from police departments across the country. I mean, in the aftermath of Rashard Brooks's shooting, and despite the body cam footage, one of the officers has been charged with murder as a result. And what that's seen since is Atlanta police officers were essentially walking off the job, like calling in sick or resigning or just refusing to respond to calls. I mean, it's been sort of nicknamed the blue flu. Additionally, what we've been noticing also is that with the NYPD, they've been officers on the ground have become quite frustrated with by their treatment from their senior commanders and city officials. And there could even be a case where upcoming on July 4th, they'll be looking to simply walk off the job, do their own sort of version of a blue flu protest. It seems to sort of be culminating for the NYPD. It seems to be a culmination of what appears to be, I suppose, years of animosity. In some cases, it appears to be absolute contempt for city officials, especially towards Mayor Bill de Blasio.
In regards to the groups and the protesters themselves, how sustainable are their achievements and their aims?
Ironically, it's actually a bit quite unlikely. I mean, I suppose when it comes to their most recent achievements, they've actually been very effective. You know, they've been able to set up autonomous zones, and narratives are getting accepted by city officials. But I reckon over time, this could actually become quite a bit self-defeating. particularly so that when they set up autonomous zones and actually calls for defunding the police, I think over time it's going to be the effects of essentially abolishing or limiting police resources is going to become noticed by wider population, which of course is going to hinder their ability to, I suppose, go about their daily lives and even work in some cases. And as a result, that's going to, I suppose, create quite a bit of hostility towards left-wing extremist groups like Black Lives Matter and Antifa, and also it's going to put city officials in a bit of a difficult situation, because of course they'll be coming up for re-election at some point, and while they've been accommodating a lot of these groups, it's going to become a case where if they continue to do so, it's going to turn the vote. It's going to limit their chances of being voted back in, because the wider population is going to want law and order.
Thank you very much, Matt. And next we're going over to Daniel Harrington, who's taking us through what he's seen in Europe.
Hi, Laura. So in Western Europe, far left extremists generally operate in decentralized anarchist cells. This is reflective of their ideology. So you have Antifa, which really generally consists of a loose confederation of groups with ideological similarities, but potentially different social agenda priorities. So you may find certain cells prioritize attacks on the patriarchy or environmentalism or animal rights, for example. In countries such as Greece, we've seen established far-left groups such as Ruvicanus generally attempt to take advantage of current social or economic situations to further their objectives. I think this is reflective of a lot of far-left extremists, that they'll see a certain economic or social situation, and they'll attempt to steer or manipulate that into a more violent anti-state confrontation. And we saw that on the 3rd of June in Athens with protesters at a George Floyd demonstration using molotov cocktails against police. It is assessed that within the protesters there were elements of far-left extremists attempting to agitate or incite violence against the state. What we see is that generally social upheaval emboldens these groups on a tactical level, which allows them to increase direct action targeting of commercial businesses or government groups or organizations which they feel goes against their own far left value system. So we see that also being reflected in Germany. In Berlin, for example, we recently saw more George Floyd protests with far left extremists rioting in New Cologne in Berlin, vandalizing shops on the 5th of June in the name of George Floyd and BLM. These groups traditionally have had gripes against gentrification within Berlin and have almost set up their own semi-autonomous zones in eastern Berlin in Friedrichshain, and there they'll conduct direct action targeting estate agents or construction companies, arson attacks on vehicles or vandalization of shops, to what they see as capitalism infiltrating all neighborhoods and leading to inequality. So we can see that these organizations will essentially latch on to a prominent social or crisis at the time and attempt to use that to really push their own agenda. And we've seen this historically with the Occupy movement, or in Greece with the economic deterioration there. And again, mirroring what we saw in Berlin with far left groups setting up semi-autonomous zones. We've seen that as well in Athens, in Exarchia, where also far left anarchists have set up an area that within Exarchia along Patterson Street, where properties are squatted in and also police are regularly targeted with violence.
So do you see these far left groups increasing in violent activity in Europe?
I think a weak police response or heightened social unrest will only embolden far left groups to conduct further direct actions targeting commercial businesses or state institutions. including as well, particularly prominent individuals. So if that's the case, we can see, we can anticipate increased targeting of financial organizations, luxury brands, and even perhaps CEOs or politicians and other companies involved that do not align with the far left's value system. We saw that back in 2011, 2012 with the Occupy movement, where prominent CEOs from financial organizations were receiving a lot of targeted hate messaging, etc., and threats on their lives. And that's something that we could see potentially escalating this year as well.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And next, over to Max.
Thanks, Laura. So left-wing extremism in Asia tends to take a slightly different theme, I guess, than in Europe and North America, in that it's mostly restricted to communist insurgencies, such as the New People's Army in the Philippines, the Naxalite rebels in India, and other groups across the region. But today I just want to focus more specifically on the New People's Army, or the NPA, who are based in the Philippines. The NPA is a communist group, and they've been designated as a terror group by both the EU and the USA, and they're highly active within the Philippines itself. They're based across the country, and they have quite a strong geographical spread, and the group is divided into different branches, and that's how they operate in this very widespread, very geographically difficult country. Recently, actually a few days before this podcast, to highlight the threat posed by the NPA, Duterte actually said that he believes the New People's Army is more of a threat to the Philippines than Abu Sayyaf. Now, a bit of background on Abu Sayyaf. They are a group that part of Abu Sayyaf is linked with the Islamic State, and they have been involved in a series of very violent attacks against both the Philippine military as well as civilian targets in the south of the country. So this is quite the claim from Duterte, to say that he feels that this communist rebel group is actually more violent and more of a threat than Islamic State affiliated groups. So the group's activity, and so what's brought them this threat level, I guess. So the group's activity is actually largely limited to incidents such as skirmishes involving military forces and IED attacks on military convoys and even government targets at times. Also, though, the NPA has directly targeted business in the Philippines, particularly in remote areas, and they've been quite selective in the businesses they target. So often they target construction companies, road construction, or logging companies, as well as mining, and they often try and extort money from these groups. From these companies. And some of these companies do pay, knowing that if they don't, they'll probably be targeted by the NPA, because these regions are so remote, you can't count on support from the military as and when you need it. Others don't, though. And to those that don't, the NPA has been known to target their equipment and even their workers at times, often torching construction equipment. And they often fill this narrative by saying that that they're against the deforestation of these areas, and they often claim that that's why they're targeting these groups. But in reality, there's probably a bit more nuance to it. So you'd probably find, for a start, it's a good way of funding by extorting money out of these groups. And also, I imagine, as a group, they're very reluctant to allow the government to extend its influence into these remote rural areas, because that may possibly take away from NPA's appeal to these rural communities. The group itself used to have a very strong foreign influence. So it used to be influenced by China back in the 80s. And however, this relationship has soured more recently, and it soured when China started to introduce market reforms. And the NPA publicly criticized China of straying away from the true communist path. And as a result, they've attempted to distance themselves from China. And the reasons for this vary. I imagine, obviously, with the NPA being communist, anti-USA as well, they just want to come across as a homegrown group, and they don't want to be branded as a foreign group, which would in some ways delegitimize them in the public opinion. So whilst Chinese influence has waned significantly, there's very little data on whether there is some Chinese influence currently, and whether that can be used as political leverage against the Philippines. But as I've already said, for now, there's very little evidence to suggest that this is going on.
Thank you very much, Max. And finally, we're going over to Raj, who's discussing Africa with us this week.
Thanks, Laura. So when it comes to left-wing extremism, there haven't been any recent incidents in Africa, but one that does spring to mind is one that occurred in South Africa in 2018. It was where a couple were attacked in their farmhouse in Porterville in the Western Cape, just outside Cape Town, by 3 unknown individuals. During the attack, the attackers are said to have poured petrol over a male occupant who managed to trigger a panic alarm, forcing the attackers to flee. The three men were never captured, so details were, surrounding the motive remain unknown. But a few weeks before the attack, it became known that the words "Kill the Boer" and "Viva EFF" were reportedly spray painted on the front door of the farmhouse. After the attack, an EFF spokesperson said that the party did not condone any form of violence. Just for some context, the EFF is a political party that sits on the left or far left of the political spectrum. Its leader, Julius Malema, has in the past made inflammatory comments such as "Kill the Boer," which is an anti-apartheid song, that have raised racial tensions in the country. But broadly speaking, the party gained popularity on a platform of redressing the systemic inequalities of apartheid that remain today. The equal redistribution of land, corruption, housing, or issues around housing, more specifically, service delivery, increase in mine workers' salaries, and the working conditions and free education of the poor are some of the key features of the 2019 election manifesto. Regarding EFF activity, this year they led a protest against load shedding in Johannesburg and threatened protests at universities of an increase in tuition fees. In the past, the EFF have backed such protests and land invasions. Late last year, they also backed striking workers of South African Airways over retrenchments and threatened to shut down airports. So this sort of activity, this sort of violent activity by the EFF is violent activity is much more uncommon. It's protest activity that's much more common.
Do you think that we'll see increased EFF activity?
So before the COVID-19 crisis, South Africa slid into a recession, which is a second under President Ramaphosa. While recessions mean a worsening of living conditions, it also has an exacerbating effect on inequality. And the COVID-19 crisis has further impacted the economy and these two factors. So this means we'll see more job losses and wage cuts. Now, as part of measures to cushion the impact of the lockdown, the government introduced, among the many other measures, for the first time, a temporary grant for those that are unemployed. Now, the EFF have largely backed the government's response to the COVID-19 crisis, but have warned the government not to stop this 6-month unemployment grant. Now, unemployment is now at 30%, which is a record high, and further job cuts have already been announced in the agricultural, the telecommunications, and steel and mining sectors. Now, those in the informal sector have been heavily impacted by the lockdown and have received little help or support by the government. Now, although there has been a shift in South African politics, to the left, I do expect the EFF, along with unions, to be at the forefront of protests related to workers' rights and unemployment in the coming months.
Thank you very much, Raj, and thank you to the rest of the team as well for this week's insight. A quick reminder for our clients and subscribers, you can use the advanced filter, search for the Insight Weekly tag and take a closer look at this week's incidents. And if you're not already signed up, I'll add a link into the video description so that you can quickly and easily schedule some time online with me and see how we might be able to help. For everyone else, we would love it if you could engage with the video, share it with your network, tell us what your key takeaways were from this episode. See you all again next week.